Maybe he doesn't, like behind the altar there's usually stuff, right? Yeah. We're live? Hello everybody, we're live. Good evening. Nice to see all of you again for our last session. Do we have any special intentions we want to remember tonight? Yes, for the war in the Middle East, the tragedy that it has become, for our brothers and sisters in Ukraine and Russia as well. Anything else specific? I'd like to pray for all the gun violence we've been experiencing as a nation. All the people that we have said we would pray for, because there's probably a lot of those people in this room, with all the people that are in this room, with all the connections. I want to ask for a special blessing this week. We have an accreditation at school, so Wednesday, for that goes well. Huh? Yeah, my hair's turning grayer by the minute. What did you say? It's Wednesday. It's not the full accreditation, it's like a midterm, but still, it's pretty hectic. Yeah, so. Anything else? All right. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am. Be still and know. Be still. Be. Creator God, we raise up those prayers that were mentioned this evening. We ask that you journey with us this evening. And in a very special way, we ask that you help instill our world with peace. In your name, amen. Thank you. All right, so tonight we are to the point where we're going to get Marie in trouble. We're going to do hot buttons. So, you know, we did 2 weeks, right? We kind of set the stage for what do people think about different things? What does the church teach about what is our worldview as a Catholic Church? And then tonight what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about how we interpret that when we are navigating very, very difficult conversations. I would really encourage you to make comments tonight, because these conversations are not one-sided by any means. So as I was really thinking and praying about how I wanted to approach tonight's class, it's interesting how enlightening things are when you're really trying to see them. But the last couple weeks' Gospels, Sunday Gospels, and something I'm doing at school right now have really informed the way I'm going to present the class tonight. So I'll just leave it at that and we'll go through. I need you to stop me at any point, ask questions. I am not going to promise I'm going to have all the answers. I'm just going to do my best with these kind of conversations, because these are hard conversations to have. So the reality of this is that we have this beautiful worldview in our church, right? Beautiful teachings. And yet there's so much tension that exists within the church today. And those tensions exist because there are so many different kinds of people in the church, right? You can't put a Catholic into one format, one box, and says this is a Catholic through and through, and that's what a Catholic is, and what you can't do that really with anything, even though sometimes we wish we could. But when you think about other churches, think about even in Judaism. Judaism has different sects within itself, right? It's a world religion, and yet it has Reform Jews, Orthodox Jews, conservative Jews, and even Orthodox Jews have their own sects, right? We have Hasidic Jews. And they all exist because of the tensions that exist within Judaism and how we want to interpret and how strict we want to be. We don't have that in the Catholic Church. We don't have a bunch of denominations underneath the umbrella of Christianity. We are the biggest denomination underneath the umbrella of Christianity. We are one church, and in fact, our name means universal. And so we have all these people underneath this umbrella, which is ultimately going to cause great tension within the church. And then we have so much history that we pull from, right? We're the oldest Christian church in the world. And so we've got all this history, all this ebb and flow, all of these rules that have changed and developed and evolved. And generationally, we have different ways of looking at the church. So we really have this big unified, we say this big unified church when in fact there's all kinds of tension that exists within it. So what I wanted to do is I thought, let me look at the tensions that existed when Jesus was alive. So this is going to be a very quick remembering, okay? So I decided I wanted to just review who are the religious authorities within Judaism when Jesus Christ was walking the earth. So the first group is the Pharisees. The Pharisees, they were very strict adherents to Jewish law. They were probably the most strict adherents to Jewish law. Although they did believe you could, perhaps you could evolve a bit. So they believed in heaven, whereas other sects did not believe in heaven. But they were very much, we do have to follow these laws that have been set for us by Moses and our ancestors about purity traditions and Sabbath and all that kind of stuff. And then we have the Sadducees. The Sadducees are a smaller group, okay? They did not like newer traditions, but the Sadducees are an interesting group of men because they were more influential than the Pharisees. The reason they were more influential is because in the first century, when they were part of the religious authority of the day, they were also considered to be in bed with Rome. So the Sadducees were the ones who, and they were very well-intentioned probably. They believed that the way you were going to keep peace and keep some sense of self-rule is if you abided by what Rome wanted, right? So it always seems like, oh, you're a sellout, you're sold out to Rome. Well, maybe they thought that was the way they were going to keep the peace for the Jewish nation, and maybe they felt that's the way they could have a little bit of religious freedom under the Roman umbrella. But nonetheless, they were more inclined to be sympathetic towards and appreciate the finer things Rome had to offer them. So the next group I want to mention are the Zealots. The Zealots are the revolutionaries. Some scripture scholars would argue that maybe John the Baptist was a zealot. The Zealots are the ones that wanted to change everything, right? They were the ones who, they hated the Roman occupation so much so that they would do everything in their power to wreak havoc, sneaking out at night, burning up the storehouses of the taxes that Rome collected from the Jewish people, causing as much trouble as they could. And so the Zealots were, when you hear the word zealot, you think of the word revolutionary or extremist, right? They're a zealot. It's not a word, I wouldn't necessarily appreciate it if somebody called me a religious zealot, right? It sounds like you're a little bit extreme. And then we have the high priests, the chief priests. These are just all different names. They were the ones who were responsible for the religious traditions, like they were the ones that lived them out, and they would do temple sacrifices, and so these were kind of like the priests of today, okay? And then finally, the scribes. Scribes were trained in writing and they were trained in interpretation of the Jewish law. So they were very influential. They don't get a lot of press in the New Testament. They don't get as much press as the Pharisees and the Sadducees do. But the scribes were pretty prominent people. And so they would help interpret and help people to understand what was expected of them. They were well educated. They could read and write. Okay? So why am I talking about these different groups? Any ideas? Yes, I agree. I think Mary said that we kind of have the same thing today. Is this on? Hello? Good?
Check, check. Now it's being a stinker again. See, it's on. It's unmuted. Oh, it's muted at the board. All right.
Okay. So Mary said we kind of have the same thing today. I think that we do have the same thing today. We have people who kind of dig themselves in and they think that they're the ones that are doing right. They're the Catholics that are doing right by the church, you know? It's easy, like, I'm not looking at people and saying, well, they're a Pharisee or they're a Sadducee. I'm saying these people, we exist in the climate of the church today. We have people who are very dogmatic, right? Very much you just follow the rules. You don't dispute them, you don't debate them, you just do it. And then we have people who are like, we have to burn the church down, we have to start again, right? We have to this is ridiculous. We have to allow everything society wants, the church should want. And so we have everything in between. So when we have these conversations, the difficulty starts to make itself known when one says, how far is too far? Like, how do we maintain the ideals and the identity of Catholicism and yet still love people, accept people unconditionally, and bring everybody into this thing that we call church? Because we have people that feel very excluded by the church because of some of her teachings, right? So, this is kind of what we're going to be talking about. So I wanted to look at this particular reading, and this is just kind of set our tone for tonight. This was from this weekend, right? The scribes and the Pharisees have taken their seats at the chair of Moses. Therefore, do and observe all things whatsoever they tell you. But do not follow their example, for they preach, but they do not practice. Okay? They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on people's shoulders, but they will not lift a finger to move them. All their works are performed to be seen. They widen their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels. You all know what a phylactery is, right? They wear the Shema on their forehead and on their forearm with the prayer, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, right? They love places of honor, banquets, seats of honor in synagogues, greetings in marketplaces. And then he says, you have but one teacher, and you are all brothers. Call no one on earth your father. You have but one Father in heaven. Do not be called master. You have but one master, the Messiah. The greatest among you must be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, but whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Now, why do you think that I wanted to bring this reading to the forefront of our conversation? Any ideas? It helps what, Kathy? It helps to dispel the tension. Okay. Anybody else? Any ideas? Why I might have brought this to the forefront of our conversation?
With regard to the hierarchies, the priests and the...
I don't know. What do you hear when I share this with you?
Well,
here, is this?
don't.
Sorry.
Don't do as the Pharisees do, but rather follow the law as they say. But it seems to me that I'm going to stop right there.
Okay. Okay.
I want to hear where you're going.
Okay.
I think what they're saying is the Pharisees tell you what to do, but they don't practice it themselves, and that, that is not the way of God.
Okay.
And I know from this week's reading, don't call anyone father except for God. And as he said today, this weekend, Mr. and Mrs. was actually Master and Mrs., and that is okay. So they were exalting themselves, but telling everyone else they could not exalt themselves or the Pharisees. Only God could be
Okay.
called rabbi. Or
Mary, you got to hold that closer to your mouth.
oh, I'm sorry.
You're fine.
Okay. They were positioning themselves as greater than the common people, when in fact all it was for show.
Okay. Anybody else?
Hank Smith, who's watching from home, says, because we're all equal.
Okay.
And my 2 cents is that when we're talking in regards to our how faith informs our lives, what we see a lot out in the world today is a lot of people wearing T-shirts with scripture verses on them and wearing crosses and telling everybody how Christian they are. But then, then when it comes right down to what their actions are, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've been cut off in traffic by trucks that have Jesus stickers on the back.
Yeah. Yes. So this kind of sense of hypocrisy, right? That we have, hypocrisy has been around for as long as humankind has been around. People who present a certain way or present a certain belief, values, and then somehow they end up, acting differently or behaving differently. And hypocrisy is really hard to swallow. And I think that it's important that we realize, I have to be very careful how I word this. I think it's important that we realize, I'm trying to be very genuine and transparent. As beautiful as our church is, some of the teachings feel heavy because they feel like they're not living up to the fullness of the gospel message. And I don't mean that in any disrespect, because I think the truth of it is that when you have an institution, and the church is in fact an institution, right? Institutions can only go so far before they start giving you conflicting messages, right? Because it's impossible, if you want people to understand what it means to be Catholic, live under certain guidelines, follow certain expectations, at some point they have to butt up against each other. And so then I guess what I want to say is that as this conversation unfolds, where does that leave individual Catholics in the way that they present and in the way that they understand the church and how they live that out in the marketplace, which is what we started with in the beginning?
I get great comfort from the very first statement. Then Jesus spoke. So if we can continue to go back to that and measure that between what's being said, what's being done, and how we're supposed to behave.
A little closer to your mouth, please.
Okay. It's pretty self-explanatory.
Okay.
I mean, the whole thing is, it's all laid out for us.
Okay.
Isn't it?
Well, is it? She said, isn't it? But is it? Is it that simple? And I think that's where the tension lies, that it's really not that simple.
Do we make it harder?
I think that any institution that wants to hold people to a standard in its very nature, makes things harder. Any institution. Okay?
To go back to what I've learned in this church here, we have to have laws. The laws have to be there, but there's always exceptions to those. And we have to be able to accept those and to go back to the original teachings of Jesus, who never omitted anyone from his preaching or from his dinners or anything of that sort.
Okay, so that, Mary, is actually a nice little step into I thought this slide was a little earlier. It's going to come. Part of the conversation is consistency and slippery slopes. So let's hold on to those two words, okay? Consistency and slippery slopes. You guys have to remember that I swim in a world of teenagers, and they're constantly just, and I got smart teenagers. I mean, I teach two dual enrollment classes, and these kids are smart, right? Got smart kids, and they want to know. And you got to stand in front of them. And if you can't stand in front of them and explain it, I'm not saying defend it. I'm saying explain it. They are not satisfied. And they're going to go away very disgruntled clients if they can't at least understand. So this idea of consistency and a slippery slope are very important. So let's hold those thoughts for a minute, because we're going to come back to those, okay? So, as I said, what does this all mean if we're trying to live out this Catholic worldview, right? What does this look like for us? I want to talk about Francis for a minute, and then we're going to get into our different conversation about some of our topics. Francis is an interesting fella, right? There are some Catholics in the church who will say, Francis is not my pope, right? There are some die-hard, rule-following, communion-receiving Catholics who say, he is not my pope. And I'm just like, but he is. You can't, just because you don't like the guy, you can't say he's not your pope because he's your pope, right? I mean, there are Americans who say that about presidents. There are bumper stickers as such. Joe Biden is not my president. Well, he is. You might not like him, might not agree with his politics, but he is your president.
I was just going to add that there are some that say it's not just it's not my pope, he is not the pope for anyone. They're called sedevacantists.
Say it again? What are they called?
Sedevacantists.
Oh, I've never heard that word before.
The seat of the Pope is empty. He's illegitimate.
Are you serious? Now,
yes.
See, I've never heard that
spoken
of in those terms.
There are many true people that believe that, and not only for this Pope, some believe the last 2 or 3.
Even Benedict?
Yep.
Man, you talk about black and white when you get to popes. I don't know. Okay, that's interesting. I've never heard that term before. So I was curious. I did some statistics the first week. I was just curious what Americans thought of the Pope. And I was actually surprised the statistic was as high as it was. That 6 in 10 U.S. adults view the Pope favorably. I was kind of surprised by that. So that's just interesting to me. If it's interesting to me, you have to hear it. So then I decided I wanted to see some of the reasons that people think that the Pope is too liberal, because that is a general consensus of people who don't like him. He's just too liberal. He's trying to change the church. And we just need to not do that. Some of the most radical things that he's done, I don't know if you remember back in 2015 when he said that he wanted all priests to open up the reconciliation rooms and forgive women who've had abortions, because the church talks about abortions being an unforgivable sin. This is some of the harsh language that kind of is hard to hear, right? And he said, and I had a woman pull up to me in the car line at Father Lopez, and she said to me, she unrolled her window, and she said to me, "Did you hear what the Pope said about abortions?" And I said, "Yes, isn't it beautiful?" I think I became on her list at that point. She said, "Beautiful. Those women should burn in hell, killing babies." And I was like, "Oh, okay. Well, I'm not going to talk to you anymore." Because I didn't even know what to say, right? I was like, oh, like the venom. And I was like, do we belong to the same church? And that's, it's so fascinating, isn't it? That we're both Catholics, okay? So that was a big one. This kind of sense where the Pope kind of keeps making these allusions towards being very accepting of gay people, the LGBTQ community. He famously said, "Who am I to judge?" These are some of the things that are driving some people crazy. He talks about how atheists can absolutely get to heaven, and there are still some Catholics who want to believe that the only pathway to heaven is through the Catholic Church specifically, right? So these are all very controversial things that he's done. And I don't know if you remember the very, very first Holy Thursday, and he's done this pretty regularly since. Do you remember what he did that very first Holy Thursday? Yes, he washed the feet of prisoners. This past Holy Thursday, I think he washed in a juvenile justice center. He washed the feet of juveniles that were incarcerated. And he's also washed the feet of women, where people find that oftentimes, not in this church, but in some churches, they won't wash women's feet because there were no women apostles, technically. I'm just saying, I use the word technically, okay? So these are things that people say, all right? And so these are just, this is the tension that exists, right? How do we live this gospel message and this beautiful worldview that we talked about last week and uphold the teachings as they're written in the Catechism of the Catholic Church? And how does one manage that? And I don't think it's easy. And again, the two concerns that keep popping up is this idea of a slippery slope and consistency. And this is actually where I find my own personal tension to be the worst. So I'll give you an example. If I say, now I don't believe this. Does everybody hear me? I don't believe this. I'm not speaking on behalf of the church at this moment. I'm using this as an example. If I were to say some of the things in the catechism are just outdated, outmoded, I don't like half of the stuff in the catechism, so I'm not gonna practice that stuff, But the other half is pretty decent, so I'll pick and choose what I want to pick out of the catechism. It invalidates the catechism. Am I right? Yes. Okay. There are things in the catechism that are hard to swallow. But you can't say, well, I don't want to swallow those because I don't like them and I like the other stuff and the other stuff's okay. Because this is a lack of consistency, and it can be a very slippery slope. So slippery slopes are always fun with teenagers because they try to argue something and I'll say, okay, then, but what happens next? And then what happens after that? And then you get to a point where what is happening is irredeemable, right? So keeping in mind this idea of consistency, and this idea is that sometimes when we start walking down a particular pathway, it simply becomes a slippery slope. Should we allow people to choose to end their own lives if they're in a lot of pain? Many would argue, absolutely, people have a right. We end the lives of pets if they're suffering. We should end the lives of people. They should have that right. That's a real slippery slope you start going down, right? If you start saying, well, it's okay to end your life for this, and it's at this time, and then, well, maybe maybe my child is in pain, and so I'm going to end my child's life, even though my child can't make that choice, and so on and on and on. And that's a very good example of a very slippery slope. And the church stands in a place, and this is again the beauty and the tension. The church stands in a place that says it's never right. And if it's never right, there's no slippery slope. Okay? But then when we start talking about things like, well, should we allow same-partner marriages? People are like, well, yeah, but then if you're standing in this place and you're going to be consistent, what does that look like? Right? And so that's kind of how we are stuck in these confusing places sometimes. And I don't pretend to have the right answers, but I do know some of the ways that we need to maybe where we can land to make it a little more comfortable. Do you remember last week one of the things that we talked about was forming our moral conscience? You remember that teaching of our church? It's a very beautiful teaching. So one of the things that I think, again, when I talk about what makes the Catholic Church so wonderful, the Catholic Church believes in a well-formed conscience that we must follow. We are obligated to follow. Remember all those parameters surrounding that. But we must follow it if it is well-formed and informed. And then she talks about being well-educated in our faith so that we can look at it with intelligence and reason. The church believes in reason, right? The church believes in natural law. These things are very important in church teaching. And the other thing that's really beautiful about the church is that I think, albeit slowly, the church does evolve. If the church didn't evolve, we would never have a council. We would never have a church council. We would have no need for a church council, right? So church councils are a form of watching the evolution of the church unfold. And just most recently we had the Synod of Synodality. Is that what it was called? The church is the only place in the world that can come up with this stuff, the Synod of Synodality. And so this is all these listening sessions that happened, and then it goes to the Synod, and now the Synod of Synodality is listening to all. It's a listening of the listening. Didn't get very far, though. Not a whole bunch came out of that, unfortunately, right? No, we just had a session. Is it going to be continued? Is it guaranteed? They're going to. Are they going to talk about the same topics? Okay, so we're going to repeat. Wash, rinse, repeat. Okay, so we'll see how that goes. So anyway, but the church does evolve. Again, just like we look at the sacred scriptures. If you think that this is a book that's done because it's written and whatever's written on it is literal, then that means there's no room for growth and evolution. Well, that's the same of the church, right? The church has to evolve. So these are the things that make the church really beautiful. That the church trusts her people to some degree to say, we can only go so far with you, and then you've got to finish this. You've got to be educated. You've got to be informed. You've got to make these decisions. And we will look at the world as it evolves, and we will try to present ourselves with that world instead of separate and apart from the world, right? Which some churches want to do. Some churches want to just be completely isolated away from the world. So I think those are the things that are really beautiful and give us great hope. So what I want to do, kind of having done all that preamble, is I want to just put up some topics up here. Now, these topics were a combination of what people asked me to talk about, what I asked people, if you were listening to, if you wanted to hear about some topics within the church, what would you want to hear about? We don't have to look at all of these. This is where I need you to engage and to talk about what you want to talk about, and the challenges that are presented to us as Catholics trying to genuinely, integritiously live out our faith in the world, in the marketplace, okay? So I'm just going to click this, and I'm going to hold my breath. So some of these are a little bit overlapping, but these are the things that people have mentioned that they feel need perhaps reevaluated, that are confusing, that present in a confusing way, that somehow some people feel conflict with the gospel message. So let's have it. Russian roulette. Where are we going tonight? Wait a second. Don't talk. Hold that thought. Where'd it go?
It's over here.
Oh.
There was a book that I heard about on NPR, and the name of it was, I can't repeat the whole name because I don't remember it, but the significant beginning was Queer Ducks. And as it turns out, the entire animal kingdom has aberrations. And so why should we be exempt?
And when you say that, you mean that they have gender-like relationships. The microphone's not working, Hillary. Yep, go ahead.
One of the examples they gave.
Go ahead.
Okay, eat the mic. I remember. One of the examples they gave was that they wanted the bull in with the cow because they wanted more cattle. And the bull was not interested until they put another bull in another field, and then he was alive.
Okay. So this is a book that talks about the animal kingdom and same gender attractions. Is that fair? Okay. Anybody else want to? Okay. So we're talking about same-sex unions. All right. So what do we know about what the church teaches about homosexuality? Does the church teach that? Something you can't be educated out of? I'm asking what the church teaches about it.
The church's teaching is that homosexual thoughts or feelings in of themselves is not a sin.
Exactly correct. What do they call homosexuality in the church? There's a word, I shudder when I say it, but this is a word that we use, and it's in the catechism.
Sodomy.
Nope, disordered.
Disordered.
Yes, homosexuality is a disordered. Okay? So that's actually in the catechism. It's a disordered, I don't know what do I have it up here? Homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. I put a few quotes just because I wanted to make sure. Now, it also says we need to treat, I think somebody said this, you said this at the beginning, Darren, we have to treat gay men and women with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. So we're talking about a couple different things when we talk about same-sex unions. The first thing we're talking about is what does the church teach about homosexuality? And then what does the church teach about gay marriage? Because that's another part of that idea, right? So in the United States, gay marriage is legal right now. The Supreme Court might try to overturn that. We don't know if that's what the political climate looks like, but right now it is legal. So it's very hard for me to say that we talk about people as being disordered. And I think this goes to Kathy's point. By most statistical analysis, and I think this number is I think this number might be a little bit low because I think people are not necessarily always honest about their gender identity. They would say 10% of the population is gay, right? That's kind of a statistical baseline. To use the words intrinsically disordered to me sound painfully harsh. And I don't know how those words were the ones we ended up putting in our catechism. So it makes people, I shouldn't say that. I am not speaking first person. I would imagine, and I've had conversations, that people walk away thinking the church hates gay people. Would you agree with me with that? Which is not true. That is not the teaching of the church. Unfortunately, this harsh language lends itself to that interpretation. So we go back to we are all created in the image and likeness of God. We all have human dignity. We must be treated as such. That's every human being that walks this planet.
Marie?
Yes.
I have two questions. One being, what year was that part of the catechism written? And also, what was the initial language that the catechism was written in?
Well, the catechism is always initiated in Rome, and then it's given to the countries, and the countries translate it into the vernacular of the country. It's a huge process. The catechism was revised in 1997. I could be wrong about that. Please don't quote me. If somebody wants to, I feel like I'm in school. If somebody wants to open their Chromebook and look it up. Was it 96? So it was someplace in that ballpark. Am I remembering that correctly? In the late 90s, it was revised. So I don't know what the original language says. I only know what the English translation says, to your point, which is a good point. Does that help?
Yes. Well, it was just, my curiosity was it was probably Italian, and maybe it doesn't sound as harsh in Italian. I don't know.
There are not always great translations. I would agree with you. We find that with scriptural translations. We don't always have the right words. They don't match up well. But nonetheless, English-speaking people are hearing these words intrinsically disordered, and it feels very unwelcoming and hostile almost. I think it feels personally. This is a personal opinion. I think it feels a little bit hostile. Yes.
In the last few years, I've realized that a lot of people that I've known through my lifetime were born that way. They're gay.
Yeah.
I have a friend right now that has a little boy that's only 6, 7 years old, and he's gay. And she knew that when he was a baby, that he was gay. So people are born gay. They don't, some people not. They decide later on that that's what they want to do. But a lot of people that are gay are born that way.
So the reality of it is that science would say that people are born and do not choose gender identity. And the church also the church agrees with that. The church totally agrees with that. The church says science, brain science, is all valid and has no problem believing that a person is born with a particular gender identity, but that is intrinsically disordered, which I don't even... The challenge is how we use those terms when we say somebody's born this way. I guess the word that really bothers me is disordered. I wouldn't want to say that about any human being. I think it's really a word that, if Rome is listening to me, needs to be reevaluated. Because it is the thing, it is the trigger that puts people ill at ease and feel like they don't belong. The church certainly says pastorally, the interpretation is you do belong. And then, so we say that, but then the next step is you do belong, but if you belong, you cannot be in a same-gender partnership because you should never have sex, right? So it's a rub any way you look at it. I'm just stating church teaching. It's a rub because you say any single person should not be sexually active, whether you're gay or whether you're straight, okay? So therefore, if you cannot be in a partnership, if you are gay, and have it blessed by the church, then you are going to live a life of celibacy. That's church teaching. It is difficult church teaching because we are sexual animals. You can't ever take that away. And then you get into all of these, like, you know, I think about straight people who have deviant sexual lifestyles. Is that okay because they're straight? Right? So you have to, like, it's not cut and dried. It's not simple. It's not easy. And to that end, the church has spoken and has actually written documents. There's a document written called Children, I should have looked it up again. All God's Children. I'm sorry, I don't have the name of it. It's escaping me. But it's a document about, it was written for parents who were saying to the church, my child is gay, and are you telling me there's something wrong with my child? How do I live how do I bring my child into the fold? And the church basically said, this is the teaching, we love them, we respect them, we want them to be part of us. And there's this interesting part of it that says at the end of the day, when people lay their head on their own pillows, it's between them and God. And this is where we get to, if we are well informed and we are prayerful and genuine about trying to understand and relate to these teachings, we have to ultimately make a moral decision based on our own faith journey, right? So it is difficult, but at the same time, if we are going to be welcoming to all people, the next question people ask is then why won't the church at least bless my union? Okay, and again, it's a very difficult thing. So why won't the church bless my union? Well, they won't bless your union because the church teaches us that marriage is intended, now I'm talking sacramentally, so this is again where we get the beauty and the beast in the same sentence, right? Marriage is beautiful. Marriage is intended to be covenant relationship. It's intended to remind the world of the Trinity, God, you know, the union of a man, a woman, and God is intended to be Trinitarian. It's intended to be all good things, okay? And so marriage is intended to be unitive and procreative, a sacramental marriage, okay? So it's meant to be unitive and procreative. A same-gender union cannot be procreative. And so the church would say, therefore, it is not a valid marriage. It can't be a valid marriage. This is church teaching. It's a very difficult teaching because, you know, you get into all these question marks about, well, what if the couple never consummates their marriage? Well, it's not really a valid marriage, the church would say, right? What happens if you find that you can't have children? Is that a valid marriage? There's all of these really important questions surrounding this stuff, right? But the church says that one of our core beliefs is the belief in family, and family is defined very specifically as a man and a woman who can have children. Now, this is a place where some evolution has happened. So it's the kind of a thing where you've got to move forward, and hopefully you break down some of these keep moving forward processes. We used to define family very narrowly in the world, didn't we? And now, you can't, nobody, not even the church, can define family as a father, a mother, and children. You can't do that. We do not live in that world. That world is gone. And you're going to have a family that is a father and his sister raising 3 children together, because that's the family unit that is going to manage to be a unit together, right? You're going to find a family that is, an 18-year-old girl who has a child out of wedlock, right? You're going to find a family that is all of these things. And if we're talking about family being one thing only, then we are doing a disservice to our members. Do you guys have any answers or questions or comments about this particular very difficult, challenging concept of blessing same-gender unions?
I'm a little concerned about putting the mic close to me because I'm not sure about what I'm about to say is accurate.
That's okay. That's a good disclaimer. I'm making them all night long as I'm tap dancing up here.
Awesome.
Go ahead.
I believe that was up for discussion at the Synod, is blessing the union.
Well, because when you think about what the Synod did, gathering data, it is a popular, very popular, that's not the word I want to use. It's a very hopeful conversation that is happening among some Catholics, not all, but some. And so that's how it gets to the level of the Synod of Synodality, right? But I don't think there was any movement on it.
There was no movement.
There was no movement on it.
But there was a lot of hope.
Yes, and there still may be certainly some hope. But, when you think about how the church becomes the church becomes the church because the people of the church created it in union with the Holy Spirit. I'm not saying that we did it without God, but the church becomes the church and the Bible becomes the Bible because it comes from the people.
I'm going to throw you a really difficult curve. Okay.
Do I want to hear it?
No, you don't.
Go ahead.
But it has to do with the priests, and it has to do with sexual identification, etc. I had an cousin uncle, that was a pedophile. And it was, how could the family relate to him, and what should the church do about him, and all of those questions above. Fortunately, many pedophiles go into the ministry and they go into teaching because that's where the children are. So it's another question of human beings.
So I think there's probably pedophiles in every walk of life. And what should happen? It's so fascinating because, pedophilia is really a sickness. And it is, there's a lot of arguments that people have made about this. I've heard these arguments in church circles that lifers, you guys know what a lifer is? Somebody who went into seminary in the 8th grade, high school seminary, stayed in seminary through college, never had any kind of experience of living in a typical educational or social circles, that lifers did not develop a healthy sexuality by being in the seminary, enclosed in a seminary. And because they did not develop a healthy sexuality, they were working with a very adolescent sexuality and perhaps lent itself to pedophilia. I'm not a psychologist. I'm just telling you these are talks I've heard.
That has nothing to do with same-sex unions or homosexuality.
No, it doesn't. But she brought up this idea of what do we do? So what do we do with folks? We need to ultimately, and this is always and forever, we need to be merciful, right? We need to be merciful to the victims, mostly, and their families, but we also need to be merciful to anybody who performs heinous crimes, heinous acts towards other human beings. They need to have consequences, but we also need to be merciful towards them. And unfortunately, what happens is people do not want to be merciful oftentimes. They want to see people hang, suffer the worst kind of punishment possible, especially if it has to do with children. I hear this over and over and over again when I talk to people. And I don't think we're good at mercy in general, the human world. I'm not saying us, I'm saying the humanity. I don't think humanity is really good at mercy. Yeah, I don't think we're good at it. So that's kind of where I would go with that. It's a very difficult thing. But ultimately, we have to remember that our faith is not tied up in an individual who committed these acts. That's not our church, that's not our faith, that's an individual person who we need to not look at as the church. We shouldn't look at any priest as the church. They're not the church. We are the church. And our faith journey, the church is an agent of our faith journey. Our faith journey is not the church. Are you with me? Right? Okay. So, do you have any other solutions? Let me hear from you. Solutions to blessing.
How do I say this? Yes, it's not, we shouldn't call it a marriage, but we should be able to bless a same-sex union with some kind of formal declaration.
Okay. Anybody else?
The priest doesn't perform the marriage, it's the two people.
Right.
And so I think the church could do this.
Yeah. The problem that we kind of get to is, I already mentioned the church's teaching on family life and marriage. There are some that would argue we should get out of the business of marriage altogether. I've heard this in many circles. Why are we in the business of performing marriage ceremonies? Well, it's one of our sacraments. And it's beautiful. Covenant relationship needs to be seen. It's really a beautiful thing. But it's just a complicated time. It's a complicated time, and I don't know what will happen. But this is where we stand today. And it's unfortunate for people who want to live in a loving relationship and proclaim that publicly in their church. But we're not the only ones. Not that makes it any easier, but we're not the only ones that don't do it. But there are some churches now that will bless same-sex unions. I think Episcopalian churches, maybe? Are they? No, they're not. Northern Episcopalian churches, but not down here. Yeah. 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 I think there might be a. Yeah. Because some Episcopalian churches have female priests, but not all Episcopalian churches. And is that correct? Yeah. 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 There are schisms happening in churches over some of these issues. Yes. Darren, did you want to say something? Oh, okay.
I think it was the Methodists that completely.
Yeah. There was a schism over it. Yeah. So if there's going to be a schism in a church over these topics, you know that they're really hurting people, for people to walk away and to separate themselves.
Not just to that issue of same-sex, but given our Protestant world, where we're watching every single part of the Protestant churches break apart, not only on this issue. I wonder if the Catholic Church has any future as a whole institution. I mean, you don't even agree about the Pope.
Yeah.
And yet we are, I mean, I know from this church, we are a community. We are a light. We are Christ followers. But it seems to me that we try to make life more difficult by, as unfortunately, I agree with Doreen, I think that if we follow Christ, then we know who we are and whose we are.
Yeah.
If we continue to fight over this, I think the Catholic Church may end up exactly where the Protestants have been.
Yeah. It's interesting. The church is the oldest Christian denomination in the world, and the Catholic Church. And I mean, you have these little tiny breakaways. Like there are, these folks, little teeny tiny pockets of folks in Washington, D.C. who celebrate masses in their houses with a woman who proclaims to be a priest. We have these little tiny pockets. But the church would say that they're not Catholic, right? That they are not practicing Catholicism. And this is where, our identity says there are certain things that we believe, and this is it. These are the foundational principles and beliefs, and you either are or you're not. Yeah, they're not changing radically. Like women's ordination, under Benedict, we weren't allowed to have the conversation. He asked us not to talk about women's ordination. Francis has talked about women deaconesses, right? Which historically we have had. We've also had married priests in the past, right? And so people would say, let's go back to that. Darren? There are married priests in the Roman Catholic Church if they were formally an Episcopalian priest who converted to Roman Catholicism, then we recognize their marriage, right? But even in the diaconate in the church, if a man becomes a permanent deacon and his wife dies, he is not allowed to remarry and maintain his ordination. So it's not, again, it's very consistent, right? So are women called to the priesthood? Probably, right? Are women called to be deacons? Probably. The church today says women can't be. And somebody asked me to talk a little bit about this, and they said, and don't tell me it's because Jesus only had men apostles. But I hate to tell you, that's the reason. That's part of the catechism. If you look at 1577, the church recognizes where is it? It's in there. The 12, an ever-present, ever-active reality of Christ. Yeah, so the College of the 12. That's the 12 named apostles. And so that is the reason. Is it, when you say our synod document, you're talking about Our Lady of Lourdes? Yeah, well, Darren, come on. You can read as much as you want, honey. I mean, I could probably tell it to you without reading it. Go ahead.
This is about I'll just read it.
So this was part of the listening sessions, what Darren's reading. So maybe for people who don't realize that these listening sessions happened, and Catholics were asked openly to talk about the issues that mattered to them. So go ahead.
We legitimately ask, how can we allow married priests from the Lutheran and Episcopal experience to serve while denying the same option to men ordained in the Roman Church? Women served in all capacities in the early church. To exclude half of the population because of gender is denigrating, limiting, and exclusionary. Many respondees commented that perhaps the Holy Spirit is speaking loudly to us, as evidenced by the dearth of priestly ordinations, when those are limited to single, celibate males who continue to lack adequate education and training in the fields of psychology, psychiatry, and sexuality.
Okay. Yeah, these are very challenging questions that exist within the tension of our church today.
We used to be really rude and think that it was a financial issue 300 years ago, where men could no longer marry in the priesthood.
I don't, what is it? Was it, I don't know, I can't say historically, I don't know if it was ever a financial issue. I do think it was an issue of feeling like perhaps the priests could not give their time and talent in its fullest sense to the church if they had a family to care for. I think that has been in conversation in the history of the church. I don't know about the financial part of it. I can't say that I know that or have heard that before.
But yeah, I mean, you know, it is a problem in the other churches too. I mean, you have to divide your time between family and church, and someone suffers from that if you've got to deal with both of them. And there's some priests I think could handle it. Others, it would never work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is very much dependent on people's work-life balance. What are we looking at?
This came out of New York Times. The requirement of celibacy is not dogma. It is an ecclesiastical law that was adopted in the Middle Ages because Rome was worried that clerics' children would inherit church property and create dynasties.
Interesting. Okay, that makes sense. They were afraid that the offspring would inherit the property. That's interesting. Yeah, our history is very fascinating, and the unfortunate part is that we have one small moment in the history of the church, and the history of the church is so long and so many different ups and downs that we, you know, we don't even know all of what we've inherited fully because there's been so much change and transition and different things that have happened in the history of the church. Yeah, this is a challenging question. It doesn't appear that there's going to be much movement on it anytime soon. But the church would argue that priests are the only ones that should be ordained in our church and minister in that way. We are the church, I know.
And all these things, many of these things have been ecclesiastically decided by Gregory and various people, like the early popes certainly did a lot of work on this one, but on all of your catechisms. I concern when you say church, maybe the people aren't the church anymore.
So, you know, yes, so we are the church, in fact, but we are not the hierarchy of the church. We are not the decision makers of the church. We are the body of Christ, but we do not have the same authority. We're not apostolic. Well, yes, and so because we don't have that authority, we don't have the kind of decision-making power that comes with that authority. So I don't know what else to call it but the church, because it is the church teachings, it is the body of the church that makes these decisions that we live and abide by. But it is the hierarchy that makes these decisions. It's not the people that make these decisions. I think the reason the synod came into existence is because the churches, not just Catholicism, churches in general are emptying out. People are dissatisfied with organized religion, especially in the United States, but really all over the world. People are very dissatisfied with organized religion. It is not one church or another. Every religious denomination is shrinking. And because of it, churches are starting to kind of like ask themselves, why are people leaving? What is it that is causing people to leave? And if you talk to young people, what they will tell you is that they believe, and this is a generalized statement because there are certainly very active young Catholics still in the church, but in a generalized sense, young people will say the church does not live in the real world, and the church needs to pick up its game. It doesn't welcome people who are different. It doesn't realize that the world is not like it was 100 years ago or 50 years ago. And until she realizes that and makes some stride in being more engaged in the modern conversation, it's not a conversation that many young people want to have anymore. So all churches are suffering the same fate because young people live a different cultural reality than any other time in history. A lot of it because of technology, a lot of it because we live in a very, and this is where you get into the slippery slope, we live in a society in the United States that is very morally subjective, right? Anything goes. How far is too far? These are the questions, that this is why it gets so murky. How far is too far? Is everything okay? Can I marry a monkey? And I say that facetiously, but not really, right? Is everything okay? Is anything acceptable? Can you do anything, be anything short of murdering somebody? And it's okay. And this is the kind of, moral murkiness that we're living in right now. And so, again, this is why people say you need to have the church telling us this is not okay, that this has gone too far. And so that's why these conversations just, there's no way to find an absolute correct answer when it comes to legal and moral. And how do you make those work for all people? I don't know. I don't claim to have answers. It's a very difficult conversation.
Marie?
Yes.
So there is some new emerging data, especially around Gen Z, and you have this new trad wife movement, and then you've got data sets about women like my age, many of whom are unmarried and didn't have families and whatnot. And it suggests, some of the emerging data suggests that the more traditional style of life, that people are experiencing higher levels of happiness. And you even have from Gen Z and millennials a push within churches, not just the Catholic Church, although the Catholic Church is one of them, for more traditional values. Like you have people wanting Mass in Latin, you have young women wanting to wear veils in church and things like that. So, I mean, it's interesting because we've got this synod on synodality, and, they're trying to let everybody have a voice, but we have to also be mindful that some of those voices are saying, I want more structure, I want more of a return to the old Catholic way.
Yes.
And so, I mean, it is a complicated conversation because it's not just, the more progressive values that a lot of us were kind of raised up, like, oh yeah, someday women are going to have the priesthood, and someday, priests are going to be married, and now you've actually got a younger cohort saying, no, we want to go back to the old-timey ways. So that's
a very, very valid point. As much as what Darren read, that you submit to the synod, right? Somebody else is submitting, we would like to have Mass in Latin. Okay? And can you imagine being the Pope and like really trying to walk this tightrope with all of these different voices, much of it pushing back, and really going to, when you talk about the extremes, you can have the very liberal, right? And then you have the very conservative. And I don't want to be in the very conservative court, but I don't know that I want to be in the completely 100% very liberal court. I want to see some balance. But while we're trying to figure that all out, people are living their lives and they're feeling a certain way about the things that affect their lives. So let me give you a quick example. One of the things I have up here is in vitro fertilization. Do any of you care about in vitro fertilization? Like, you do? You care about it? Like, is it a topic that you would say, let's talk about it tonight? It's not on anybody's like top 10, maybe top 5, because of your daughter. Okay, so yeah, but in vitro fertilization, it's not necessarily, you know, the thing that's on everybody's lips when you talk about church teachings and what does the church teach about this, right? And that's probably, and Kathleen just said it, I care about it because of my daughter-in-law. But if you don't have somebody in your family who's just pining to have a child and unable to do so, it's probably not something that we're overly concerned about. We concern ourselves about the issues that directly affect us, right? Everybody does that. That is one of the things that humans do. They are concerned about those things that directly affect us more acutely than other things. And so when we talk about, you know, the pain that exists because of these things, the pain is not so acute for everybody. We have a very conservative young couple married in the church. They have 3 children. They don't think we should have same-gender marriages because they're living this kind of idealized life, walking the straight and narrow. And so part of what happens in human nature is that we don't care about things until we care about them, right? We might not care about gun control until somebody we love gets killed by a gun, and then it might become different. The shooting in New Hampshire, Maine, and one of the politicians said, I voted for all of, having all of these weapons available to people, and now it happened in my house, and now I'm apologizing to you for it, because now it directly affected him and his constituency, right? Some of the challenges of all of this is caring enough about it to want it to change, okay? I don't want Mass in Latin, but there might be people who that's the most important thing in the world to them. Should we not have Mass in Latin for them? Well, theologically, I don't think that that's a great idea, but religiously, maybe it's a wonderful idea, right? Huh? Some people they love it. It does something for them. It's just so very interesting the way that we talk about, and then we talk about like inconsistencies. When you poll Catholics on abortion, it's 80% of Catholics believe abortion is wrong. When you poll Catholics on capital punishment, 55% of Catholics believe capital punishment is right. Okay, so then this is where we get our consistencies. You either believe life is sacred or you don't believe life is sacred. It's not some life, it's all life. All life is sacred. It does not matter what the person sitting on death row did, their life is still sacred. But it's easy to not see it as such because we put blinders on, right? And so that's why these conversations are so difficult. Would people care as much about blessing same-gender relationships if there was nobody in their family that was gay or nobody in their circle that was gay? I don't know the answer to that, right? But what matters to us takes a front seat. And I think what the church would say is that we need to find a place where we are standing on solid ground when we talk about these issues, that we stand in a place of goodness. And when we stand in a place of goodness, with the tools at hand, that we ultimately need to make our way through this in a way that is genuine and integritous and being faithful to God. And I think that's the only real answer to this. Because people were destroying the environment, and the Pope wrote an encyclical about it, right? And people didn't hardly pay any attention to that. So, I don't know. I feel like I'm kind of just round robin in these circles and circles because I don't think there's any clear-cut, easy answers except one, and that is to stand in a place where we are pointing our lives towards God.
With the in vitro question, it wasn't something I had ever thought I would have to consider. But I had very dear friends that went the in vitro route because he had testicular cancer, so he donated his sperm ahead of time so that they could have children. She got pregnant with 4 babies. The doctor convinced her to abort 2 of them because she was a small woman, might not be able to carry 4 babies. Later on, they separated, but they still had the eggs. And she wanted them destroyed. He didn't. What advice would I give them? And it was like,
it's quite a tale, right?
Yeah.
And that's the slippery slope. We believe in all life. In vitro creates life. But what do we do with the leftovers? Like, what do we do with those fertilized eggs? That's the slippery slope.
Then we go back to, there's a law for everything, and then there's the exceptions to the law.
And so then if we have exceptions to the law, then we get into the slippery slope. I'm not pretending I have answers. Yeah. So there's all kinds of... So these are the real things that we ultimately have to say. We have to believe in the foundational teachings of our church and understand them in a way that embraces all goodness and discern what that means for us who have a well-formed moral conscience. Right? I don't really know that there's any other answer to this. But I do know that this is also part of our gospel message that we heard last week. Which commandment is the greatest? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind. This is the greatest in the first commandment. And love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these 2 commandments. And this is, my friends, formation of conscience. The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments. This is certainly applicable in the year 2023. And I think this is where our beloved Pope lands. He sits at the corner of that tension, where he is trying to live this out and be receptive to the criminals, to people who are homosexual, to people who have had abortions, and trying not to live in that legalistic place that says, I'm a Pharisee, right? And the law is the most important thing. Because this is ultimately what Christ tells us. And this actually is the one thing that is consistent in every single world religious tradition, is that they have some kind of a saying, philosophical understanding, scriptural reference to this particular commandment. This is the single thing that unites all great religious traditions. And to me, that is revealed truth. If every religious tradition stands in this place, that is God revealing God's self to us. And the church does her darndest to help us understand how to be holy, how to live out our best life in relationship with God. But at the end of the day, it's an institution that is going to come into conflict with the day-to-day living out of this gospel message. And I don't fault the church in any way. I think it's a very difficult, challenging task. Just to one final comment on this. In 2018, Pope Francis he did something unprecedented that has never happened before. He went into the catechism, which is not a revision of the catechism. Excuse me, it's not a rewriting or an updating of the catechism. He made a revision to the catechism. And the revision was that in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it says that in certain circumstances, capital punishment is acceptable. Those circumstances had to be, you didn't have appropriate places to put criminals, they were more of a harm to society, there was no other way but to put them to death. And he came out with a revision in 2018 and said, there's no conditions that it's okay to put somebody to death. People were astounded that he did this, made this revision without a whole new edition of the catechism, and they were astounded at what he said and how he did this. The Holy Spirit is still active and alive in our church. We help the Holy Spirit. We help that discernment process. I think it's good to keep asking these questions, to keep looking at what this means as people live it out. But at the end of the day, my friends, there's two questions we should ask ourselves. Are we treating every human being with the dignity and sacredness that they deserve? And are our lives pointing to God? And when the church becomes an agent of that, it is a wonderful, living, healthy, something that we would want to be part of. And she does it really well most of the time. Because sometimes there's just going to be a rub. And you can't help but have that, because there's going to be conflicting beliefs about what's right and what's wrong in the world. That's all I got for you. Thank you. Kathy?
At one point, I thought that the Pope said that annulments should not go to Rome, that they were in the purview of the diocese.
I think annulments are in the purview of the diocese, aren't they?
Some things went to Rome. Some things
I
went
don't
to
know
Rome.
enough about that. I can't answer that
Well, I did
intelligently.
RCIA, and I had to be
Yeah.
involved. Okay.
Yeah.
The other thing that I thought that I heard recently was the Pope said Catholics do not have to have big families.
Again, I can't speak to that. I don't know.
Anybody?
Does anybody know what Kathy's referring to?
But a well-formed conscience would tell you what.
Mary said that a well-formed conscience would help with that. Thank you very much, everybody. Go in peace.
Especially after working all day. This is awesome.
I really hope I didn't say anything to get myself fired.
Are you kidding?
I'm not. It can be very misconstrued.
Well, the way I don't know where you probably are where you were doing this, but you started off with exactly what you started off with was what you finished with. It was like, that's cool. Yeah, you're gonna burn in hell.
Well, I'm not worried about burning in hell. I'm worried about not having a paycheck.
Little thank you.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
How kind of you. Can I look at it?
Of course. I visited there for Halloween for my students.
Oh.
But they have a lot of them with Bible verses and all, and I just couldn't make up my mind. Because
This is so
it's
sweet.
delicious. I took the calories out, so that's in some dietitian thing somewhere.
It's magical.
But thank you.
I love you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Why should you get fired? Yeah, you did. We all brought our underwear, so we're going to take it.